Hey guys, this is Daniel from What Obi Plays, and today we're going to take an in-depth look at the AYN Thor. This is a dual-screen, dual-OLED, Android-based gaming and emulation handheld with a clamshell form factor. Clamshell devices are all the rage this year, and while AYN was the first to announce their dual-screen clamshell device, the Pocket DS, AYN is the first to actually ship their device to customers. This is one of the more highly anticipated handheld releases in 2025, and the biggest competitor to the AYN Pocket DS. I do have both the Thor and the Pocket DS, and I will be doing a comparison video, but today we'll be focusing on just the Thor. I know pretty much everyone else has already gotten their review videos out already, but I got my Thor pretty late as I was definitely not in the first retail batch. I also just recently purchased my first home and have been really busy moving and unpacking, which further delayed this video. I've done my best to not watch any other reviews except for Retro Gamecore's video, which was a few months ago, and I have a long-term memory like Dory from Finding Nemo, so I feel like I'm going into this review mostly blind. This is a retail device that I paid for with my own money. AYN did not send this to me early, and all opinions are my own. But without further ado, let's get started. The AYN Thor is powered by the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is a well-known chip that has stood the test of time. It was first announced to the Android handheld world by AYN back near the end of 2023 with the Odin 2, and has been seen in the Odin 2 Mini and Odin 2 Portal, and most recently the upcoming Retroid Pocket 6. While this chip might be a few years old in the emulation handheld scene, it has been superseded by more powerful chips like the new Snapdragon G3 Gen 3 found in the AYN Pocket S2 and upcoming Conquer Pocket Fit, or the Snapdragon 8 Elite in the upcoming AYN Odin 3 and also the Conquer Pocket Fit. The 8 Gen 2 is still a pretty powerful chip that can emulate most of what you can emulate on Android. There is the Snapdragon 865 version that's $50 cheaper than the base model, which starts at $300, but I wouldn't bother with that model. You're better off just spending the extra $50 because the performance jump from the 865 to the 8 Gen 2 is substantial, especially when considering the price tier we're already in. The Thor has dual OLED displays, with the top display being a new 6-inch 1080p 16:9 aspect ratio 120Hz panel that is exclusive to AYN. And the bottom display is the same 3.92-inch 1240x1080 31:27 aspect ratio 60Hz panel found in the Retroid Pocket Mini V2, Retroid Pocket Classic, and the AYN DMG. The top display has a peak brightness of 650 nits, while the bottom display goes up to 550 nits. The battery is 6000 mAh and can charge at 27 watts. It has active cooling, Hall sticks and triggers with RGB around the sticks, Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3, Android 13, and it weighs about 380 grams. Now for our fake unboxing, the Thor box is pretty simple with a nice pull tab at the bottom. Opening the lid, we have some recyclable material tucked under the lid, which is always nice to see. And under this piece of foam is the Thor. In this little box is a USB-C cable, which is branded with AYN. It's pretty nice, but I don't use these because I prefer either soft rubber or braided cables. If you got a transparent model like this purple one, it comes with this little black insert and a guitar pick, which I guess is if you want to cover the ribbon cable in the lid and maybe put stickers or something to show through. I did buy the accessories pack, which comes with a bunch of stuff, starting with this soft pouch. It's pretty big with a drawstring and has a very subtle AYN branding stamped on it. It's way too big for the Thor on its own, but is a decent fit with the grip. The TPU grip comes in this box and has the grip, but also this set of stickers so you can attach it more securely to your Thor. You just slide it up on the bottom and it fits in very nicely, but it's not a tight fit. I can easily slide it on and off too easily, and you definitely want to use these stickers to make sure it doesn't just fall off. With the TPU grip on, it fills out the pouch more and looks like it was designed for it. The same goes with the hard case. This is a pretty high quality zipper case that's specifically made for the Thor with the TPU grip. I appreciate that the zipper pull is just the cord without the jingly metal pull tab. You have two options for this case, with or without the grip, but if you buy the accessories pack, it only comes with the grip compatible case, so keep that in mind. Next we have the TPU shell. The TPU shell fits pretty well on the Thor, and both the shell and the grip have a cutout so it doesn't block the fan intake, but I'm not really a fan of this kind of TPU finish. The grip is frosted and textured and feels smooth, but doesn't actually give me a locked-in grip because I can still slip my hands around it, no pun intended. And while this shell definitely locks in my hands and the device will not slip, I don't like it for a few reasons. It makes the entire device shiny and reflects light, which if you were already bothered by all glass fronts being reflective, this will definitely bother you even more. And it just feels cheap, like the feel of this rubber reminds me of when you go to your grandma's house and their couch has that clear vinyl cover. It's that kind of material. In terms of practical use, you can kind of use it with the grip, but it's obvious that the grip was only intended to be used with the naked Thor. As you can see here, the grip is stretched all around and the device isn't fully seated. The last few accessories are the screen protectors and the lanyard. They give you screen protectors for both the top and bottom screens, and the bottom one has cutouts for the controls, speakers, and microphone. I know people might say you don't need screen protectors for clamshell devices because when you close it, the screens will be protected, but I always like to use these because you never know, accidents happen. Also, if you're using a stylus for DS and 3DS games, it's a good idea to at least use the bottom screen protector. And finally, we have the lanyard. I'm not a lanyard kind of person, but I will say this is actually a very nicely made lanyard. It's got this dual-tone braided paracord with this faux leather AYN slider. My only criticism is that this part that attaches to the Thor doesn't have a swivel. Now, whether I think the accessories pack is worth the $50 depends on if you're going to use all these accessories. If you buy all these individually, the grip, case, and TPU shell are all $15 each. A set of top and bottom screen protectors are $10, the soft pouch is $5, and the lanyard is $3. So in total, it's $63 worth of stuff at full price you're getting for $50, which sounds like a good deal. However, I don't recommend the TPU shell, I don't think you need the pouch if you're getting the hard case, and I'm not a lanyard person. So if I buy just the grip, case, and screen protectors, I'm at $40, so I would probably just buy what you want separately and use the extra $10 to buy a backup set of screen protectors. For controls, we have the start and select buttons up top, which I'm sure a lot of people appreciate. The home button is on the bottom left and the back button is on the bottom right. Personally, I have gotten used to AYN's placement of the start and select on the bottom left of the device, so sometimes I mess up and press the wrong button, but I can understand that most other people probably feel the opposite when they go from something like this control layout to AYN's layout. These all use these golden dome switches that are very silent and are typically used in a lot of AYN handhelds, but for some reason they aren't as silent on the Thor as I would have thought. They're around 40 decibels and on AYN devices are typically below ambient noise level. These golden domes are softer and mushier than your typical dome switch, so they're good for buttons you won't press as much, but they're less tactile and wouldn't be good for something like a shoulder button. The analog Hall sensing sticks are almost completely recessed, and the stick caps have this soft rubber texture with a textured grip ring along the outer edge. This looks like it would help with grip, but in practice I don't think these actually help the way I think AYN intended. Because these sticks are so recessed, my thumbs are mostly touching the top of the stick caps, which is actually a little slippery even though it's rubber. My thumbs do lock into the texture, but not until the stick is almost at full tilt, so it's not as useful as if they had used this texture all over or made the grip ring extend a little more into the top of the stick cap. Otherwise, the sticks themselves are good with no cardinal snapping. I did turn the dead zones on in both the sticks and triggers to 5% in settings, which is the lowest you can set them, to try to make the sticks feel as responsive as possible. If you've used any other AYN device such as the Odin 2 Portal or something like the Retroid Pocket 5, then you know this D-pad. This is a dome-based D-pad, meaning it's clicky and also has a good pivot. AYN makes excellent D-pads, and this is more of that same winning formula. Dome switch D-pads don't really have false diagonals, since you'll feel that click when you roll from one direction to the next, and they're very precise and tactile, which is great for precision platformers like Celeste. This D-pad also has a good pivot. You can see here when I press down on the center, it doesn't bottom out, so changing directions and rolling those diagonals will feel very smooth. I have this GBA test ROM that I developed, and if we run through the false diagonal test, like I mentioned, we don't really have any concerns with false diagonals. Here I'm holding down and rocking the D-pad left and right, and unless I push really hard and force the diagonal, I'm not getting false diagonals. Because this is a dome-based D-pad, you will feel that tactile response when you transition to those diagonals. For the rolling diagonals test, we can test some Street Fighter moves. Here I'm doing the quarter circle roll for a Hadouken, and I can hit it pretty consistently. The half circle for a Shakunetsu Hadouken is a little more difficult, but I don't really play fighting games, so I just kind of suck in general at rolling these. Note that this test ROM is very strict in that you have to hit every single direction exactly for it to count, whereas in actual Street Fighter games such as Street Fighter Alpha 3 on GBA, sometimes the engine might be a little lenient, and as long as you start on the left and end on the right, I can sloppily roll through the diagonals and it will still do the move. No issues here, this is a great D-pad, and if you like clicky D-pads, I think you're going to have a good time with whatever game you want to play. I have been very critical of AYN's face buttons in past devices because they are typically very loud and clacky, and I am someone who prefers quiet controls above almost all. I do not like loud and clacky button sounds because I typically play my handhelds on the couch while my wife and I watch TV, and I don't want my devices to disrupt what I'm watching. I also play my devices in bed and don't want to wake my wife up, so loud and clocky buttons such as the face buttons on the AYN Odin 2 Portal are a no-go for me. That being said, I am thoroughly impressed with the ABXY buttons on the Thor. These are some of the quietest and least clocky face buttons I have ever used on a handheld, at least in their stock and unmodded configuration. I'm getting about 42 decibels for these face buttons, which is very good for unmodified buttons. The membranes are very stiff, and as a result, the buttons are very thocky, but they feel great to press, are very responsive, and pop back up immediately. The last button on the front is the AYN button, and this brings up the Thor Command Center, or TCC. I'll do a more thorough overview of the TCC in the software section of the video, but for now let's continue. Along the bottom of the device are the volume buttons and power button. This power button is not a fingerprint reader, so if you want any kind of security on your Thor, you'll have to use a pin or other security methods. I do not like the placement of this power button. I find it way too easy for it to be pressed, especially if I'm just picking it up and carrying it somewhere. AYN did push a software update to ignore button presses when the device is closed, but I wish that AYN had either made this more difficult to press or maybe recessed it a bit so it wasn't slightly sticking out of the frame, but it is a pretty big annoyance for me. The last controls are the shoulder buttons and triggers, and I absolutely hate these. Starting with the shoulder buttons, they are very clicky and very loud and are the loudest buttons on the entire device at around 50 decibels. I thought these were true micro switches, but when I opened it up, I found out that they're similar dome switches as the D-pad, but for some reason these small ones are absurdly loud. You can press them down anywhere along the button and even on the sides, which is a small positive. The triggers are the second worst controls on this device. For one, they are comically small. I have standard size hands and they aren't even as big as the last section of my index finger. They have a smooth surface with just a tiny bit of an upward curve to try to retain your finger grip, but that's not the issue here. The issue is with their shape and movement. They have this semicircle-like shape to them, and that's not a great shape for a trigger. These triggers move straight up and down, but that's not how your fingers actually move when pulling a trigger on a handheld. If I move my fingers up a bit so they're floating in the air and act like I'm pulling on an imaginary trigger, you can see my index fingers go down like you expect, but they also go slightly inward. I can try to force my fingers to move straight up and down to match these triggers, but it feels awkward and unnatural and actually puts strain on whatever tendon this is in my hand and is quite uncomfortable. Also, because my fingers naturally want to go inward when I pull down, the joint of my finger presses into this edge of the trigger, further adding to my discomfort. AYN addresses this with their devices by angling the trigger travel inward a bit so it's not straight down. You can see here on both the Pocket Ace and Pocket S2, the travel is not straight down and it feels much more natural to pull. They also fully curve the trigger piece around to the sides, and if AYN had done something similar, that would have gone a long way towards making these a little more ergonomic. Speaking of ergonomics, the Thor is not ergonomic. Okay, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not that far off from my opinion, and I'll explain why. If you're holding this device like a controller and just using the left analog stick and ABXY buttons and maybe the shoulders and triggers, it's not that bad. I don't always use the tip of my thumb to press these buttons, so I'll press A and B with the base of my thumb and X and Y with the tip of my thumb, and it's still comfortable because my thumb remains straight. Same with the left stick, I use the center of my thumb to move around. However, this is really the only hand position I've found that's comfortable, at least for me. Using the controls like this puts you in this weird limbo where you're playing some more modernish games that use the left analog stick, but without using the right stick. So I can play God of War 2 pretty comfortably, and sometimes I need to shift my right hand to dodge with the right stick. But this is a pretty limited use case where this is comfortable, and if I'm playing D-pad centric games like Metroid Fusion on GBA, I could scrunch up my thumb to keep the same grip, but this isn't comfortable at all and gets crampy. If I keep my left grip pretty loose to create space for my thumb, now I'm stretching my finger to hit the left shoulder button so I can shoot diagonally, which is also uncomfortable. I can't even stretch my fingers out across the back because the device is so narrow, my fingers end up on top of each other. It's even less comfortable when trying to play dual-stick games like Metroid Prime Remastered. Playing with a full grip is very cramped and not comfortable, especially for using that right analog stick. I ended up holding the device very loosely like this, which lets me access all the controls, including the shoulders and triggers, while keeping my fingers straight, but obviously this looks like a very weird way to play on a handheld. The TPU grip does help in certain situations, like if you're playing a game that doesn't use the right stick all the time, like in Tomb Raider Definitive Edition. In this game, you're mostly running around solving puzzles and moving the camera with the right stick in the occasional combat sequence. But if I'm trying to play Metroid Prime Remastered, you can see that as soon as I need to start aiming, I still have to shift my right hand to comfortably reach the right stick. I strongly believe that if you need to buy a grip to make a device comfortable, then it's not ergonomic, and that's the case with the Thor. And it's even worse here because the grip doesn't even solve everything. So you either play cramped or with a weird grip and maintain this device's pocketability and portability, or you use the grip and still have to make compromises sometimes. It's lose-lose. The Thor is also pretty slippery in my hands. The plastic is pretty smooth, and while it does have a bit of texture to it, that texture doesn't help me grip it better. You can use the TPU shell, which will definitely make it grippy, but then it's just super reflective all over. In terms of the hinge, I'm 50-50 with the hinge on the Thor, and I'm not talking about the hinge reliability. The hinge on the Thor has 3 detents, one at about 120 degrees, one at about 150 degrees, and fully open. The first detent is good if you want to sit it on a table and watch some YouTube videos or a movie. The second detent is what you'll be using to play games, and this angle is just a little bit too steep, and here's what I mean. If I keep my fingers straight and hold the Thor, the top display is angled in a way where it's not pointing straight at my face, but more at my neck and upper chest, so the viewing angle is off. I can bend my wrist slightly forward, and that will make it so the top display is correctly oriented, but now I'm putting strain on my wrists and stretching this tendon out, which will hurt over time. You want to keep your wrists and arms straight so that you're not straining anything, and you could just push it all the way back so it's at 180 degrees, but now it's angled too far back, and the viewing angle is off again. I wish AYN had made this angle a little more flat so the screen would be positioned more closely to an original 3DS. You can see the angle comparison here where the 3DS is a little more flat in the open position. In terms of hinge reliability, there's been a lot of activity in the community because there were some images posted of a user who experienced a cracked hinge, and it looks similar to the cracks on the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 hinge. If you didn't know, AYN and Retroid are both under the same parent company, Morechip, and they do share a lot of the same design language, so the fear was that this was a Flip 2 hinge all over again. It all came from this line in the lid, which is essentially a manufacturing line, and where the plastic meets together after going around the hole in the mold. You might see it on your device, you might not, but that line is there. Now, because this is a seam where the two sides meet, this would be the weakest point, and if the hinge were to crack, it would likely crack here. So if you end up getting a Thor, I'd check this occasionally and make sure it's still solid. I'm not educated enough on manufacturing to know if they could or should have molded these differently, but so far I haven't seen widespread issues of actual cracks, so I'm not currently worried about my hinge cracking. The Thor has dual OLED screens, with the top display being a brand new 6-inch 1080p 16:9 display, and the bottom display is the same 3.92-inch 1240x1080 31x27 panel used in the Retroid Pocket Mini V2 and Classic, as well as the iNeo DMG. In terms of size, the 6-inch top display is a good size and lets this device overall remain very pocketable and portable. I think once you get up to a 7-inch screen, there's no way you're pocketing that device, so if that's something that's important to you, I would say this is the upper limit of screen size. Now, there was also another recent scare with the Thor, and that was with the image retention on the top screen. If you have some bright logo or UI element on screen and then switch to showing a dark screen, then you can sometimes see remnants of what was previously there, and people were wondering if this was some kind of early OLED burn-in. It turns out that this is likely a software bug with AYN's Android image, and K's Retro Gaming made an excellent video explaining this, which I'll leave linked below. He shows that this isn't a hardware defect but is most likely a software issue. Hopefully AYN can fix this with their next update, but I personally haven't noticed any retention myself. It might be there, but I'm not sensitive to it. Otherwise, there's not much else to say about the top screen, so let's look at the bottom screen. 31x27 and 1240x1080 is a really weird aspect ratio and resolution for retro gaming because it's not good for any retro system whatsoever. When I say it's not good, I mean that there will always be compromises if you're trying to integer scale older systems like GBA or SNES. 31x27 is very close to 10x9, but even with the aspect ratio, if you try to integer scale Game Boy or Game Boy Color, you will have letterboxing on all sides. The same with Nintendo DS, which is what this device is supposed to be good at, you won't get those perfect pixels. If I load up Advance Wars Dual Strike in the dual screen fork of Melon DS, with integer scale turned on, you can see how small the image is compared to the overall display, and at least the emulator pushes the images towards the center so they're visually close, but this is still not the greatest experience. And if I turn off integer scaling, I get a big black bar at the bottom, so I'm still not able to utilize the whole bottom display. 3DS is a better experience because the top screen is wider. The bottom screen is still 4x3, so we're still getting the same black bars as a regular DS, but the top image fills out more of the display, resulting in very small black bars on the sides. And because it's more 3D based, integer scaling doesn't matter as much, so it doesn't bother me when scaling to fill up the display. For 4x3 3D-based systems like PS2 or GameCube, you wouldn't really be worried about integer scaling, but you'll still have to deal with some black bars on the top and bottom. And I wouldn't bother playing any 16:9 content, which looks comically small, and you have no reason to anyways since the top display is 16:9. Both screens get decently bright and have great color saturation because they're OLED. It's been cloudy and rainy here lately in Seattle, so I can't do a sunlight test, but these displays get very dim at the lowest brightness setting, so this would be great for playing in bed. When you close the lid, the device will go to sleep, and the top screen will rest on these two little rubber pads on this little chin, which is similar to the 3DS design. This keeps the screens from touching each other, and also the controls don't put pressure on the top screen. However, I did notice that if I push down on the lid, I can flex it enough to where I can actually click the analog sticks on either side. So I would be careful about allowing anything to rest on top of your Thor because you don't want any unnecessary and unbalanced force on that screen. The Thor has dual front-firing speakers, which is always nice to see. If we use the Horizon Chase opening soundtrack, here's a graph of the volume in decibels at each volume step. At max volume, it gets up to about 92 decibels, and at the lowest volume step, it's around 41 decibels, so very quiet on the low end. However, there's something weird about these speakers when playing emulation. Here I'm running Hades 2 on Switch using Citron, and at max volume, it's only hitting about 79 decibels during the heavy guitar solos in the title screen music. If we overlay the volume graphs for Android games versus emulation, we can see how much lower in volume emulation is compared to native Android games. In my Silent Button Mods video, I go over how decibels use a logarithmic scale, not linear, so while 79 decibels might seem like it's 15% quieter than 92, it's actually more like 60% quieter, which is substantial. It really does sound so much quieter than with native Android games. It's very unfortunate, and hopefully AYN can fix this with a software update. Running through my audio quality tests, first we'll start with some dialogue from Trails in the Sky first chapter.
It may look easy, but it's way harder than it looks.
Compared to your skills with a staff, I think it's pretty easy. It's just a matter of focus.
I just get sleepy whenever I try to do that kind of mental stuff.
The voices are clear with no muddiness to my untrained ears, and overall it sounds good. Moving on to Octopath Traveler 2's opening theme, which has the full range of sounds. Here we're specifically listening for the deep bass of the drums and the highs of the trumpets. The mids and highs are clear with no screeching when the trumpets are playing. However, the bass is non-existent. You can barely hear or feel any difference when the drums are beating, which is disappointing. For a retro game, we'll play some Metroid Fusion, one of my favorite GBA games. Everything sounds crisp and clear here, and we don't really care about the lack of bass. And finally, we'll play some Hades 2 so you can get a feel for how some more complex sound effects layer with the background music. Okay, let's do a deep dive into the software experience because a lot of this is new for the Thor. I'm running the latest update, which is 1.0.0.293. Before we go into the Thor Command Center, I'll give a very quick overview of the typical AYN software experience. When you set up your Thor, you have the option of choosing between the stock QuickStep Android launcher, which looks like this, or with AYN's Odin launcher. The Odin launcher lets you add your apps and games as tiles and gives you easy access to the Thor specific settings. If you want something extremely simple, this might be a good launcher for you, but personally I've never used this. Most of the quick settings like changing the performance mode or fan setting are in the pull down menu. So pulling down on the status bar, we can see all the commonly used settings as little widgets, and it all integrates with the Android system very nicely, and you can reorder or remove any of these you want. With Thor Command Center or TCC, I almost never need to use these widgets. You access the TCC by pressing the AYN button at the bottom center of the device, and there are three main sections. The first tab, which is the Mode tab, lets us control the dual screens. So we can turn both screens on or only use one or the other. If you select only top screen, then you just need to press the AYN button again and the bottom screen will turn back on. We can also adjust the brightness, and you can control them independently or both at the same time, and AYN did a pretty good job syncing up the brightness, especially since the top screen goes up to 650 nits and the bottom screen only goes up to 550 nits. And finally, we have a volume mixer, so we can set the top and bottom screen volume independently. You can imagine having a movie playing up top and a game on the bottom, and turning down the game volume so you can hear the movie better is pretty great. Note that the physical volume buttons will only adjust the top screen, so you have to use the TCC to change the bottom screen's volume. The second tab isn't really a tab, it just opens the app switcher. The last tab is where we can do the majority of tweaking and fiddling. This big block here shows the current FPS, and if you tap on the 60 FPS mode, you can toggle to 120 FPS mode. The Android system has a limitation that external displays, which this bottom screen is technically an external display, has to run at the same refresh rate as the main display. So while the 6-inch top display is capable of running at 120Hz, the bottom display can only run at 60Hz. Normally, to run the top display at the full 120Hz, you would have to turn off the bottom display, but that would defeat the whole purpose of having two screens. Retro games only need 60Hz, and if I'm streaming from my gaming PC, I'd want that 120, so AYN came up with this workaround to somehow run the top display at 120Hz while keeping the second display on, which is pretty cool. The downside is that this bottom screen has really bad screen tearing, and it is definitely noticeable. As I vertically scroll up and down this page in Firefox, you can see that there's this wave that runs across the screen as the pixels are moving, which is very distracting, at least distracting for me. My primary use case for running the top display at 120 would be game streaming with a guide on the bottom screen, so this would directly affect me, and I'm not the biggest fan of this. I think this is a pretty limited scenario where 128Hz mode is detrimental, and I really think that the majority of the time you can keep this in 60Hz mode and not have to deal with the screen tearing. You will probably be playing games on the top display anyways, and retro games and even Switch emulation only need 60Hz, so I think this is mostly a non-issue outside that one use case for game streaming. Below the FPS gauge, we have other gauges for temps, fan speed, CPU, GPU, power, and RAM usage. We can change the controller focus mode, which is useful for if you're playing a game up top and have a guide on the bottom. We can lock the controls to the top or bottom display so that when you're scrolling through a guide with your finger, the controls will always control the game. The default auto lock mode effectively uses the controls for the last screen you touched, so if you want to control what's up top, then you would tap the top display, and the same with the bottom display. You can also change the performance mode and fan mode, and there's standard, medium, and high performance, and depending on the performance mode, there's no fan, quiet, smart, sports, and at the high performance mode you get custom. I did find it weird that using custom and setting it to the max only brought the fans up to 70%, not sure why that is, but we're not able to utilize the full cooling capacity of the fan. This clean memory function will kill anything in the background to free up system resources, but I'm not sure this is really necessary, since the system should automatically free up those resources when you're running a demanding game or app. We can change the ABXY layout to be standard, which matches the face buttons with A on the right, or we can change it to Xbox mode so the A button is on the bottom. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is capable of charging separation or battery bypass, where if you have it plugged in, it only powers the device and leaves the battery alone, so you should enable the direct power supply setting if you want to play plugged in to keep your battery healthy long term. The last two things we can toggle are vibration and the RGB on the analog sticks. We can change the color and brightness of the sticks, and you can change them independently so you could have a two-tone look. Overall, I think the TCC is pretty good, especially for something that AYN developed in just a few months. I still think they have a lot of catching up to do to match AYN Neo's overlay, but this is a great first version. One thing I do like is that you can tap and hold on an app, and the screen launch option will let you choose whether to always launch the app on the top or bottom screen. This is useful if you want to pin an app to always launch on the screen you want, and some apps like Melon DS require you to launch the emulator on the main display, so it knows to show the other screen on the external display, which in the Thor's case is the bottom display. For thermal testing, I ran the Wildlife Extreme stress test with high performance mode and the custom fan mode turned all the way up. As I said before, turning the custom fan all the way up only goes to 70%, but in the end it doesn't really matter. I ran the stress test repeatedly from 100% battery until it died as part of my battery tests, and I'll show those results in a bit, but overall this device is very thermally stable. I get an average score in the mid 3600s with the lowest loops right under 3600, giving us an average of around 98% stability, which is excellent and very typical of AYN handhelds. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 doesn't seem to run very hot, only hitting the mid 60s during the stress test. The fan itself isn't very loud and I don't hear any coil whine at max, just a whooshing sound. One funny thing about this fan is something I'm calling lightsaber mode. This is the first device I've owned that does this, but when the fan is on, if you move the device around, the fan makes this buzzing sound. It's a little annoying but also slightly entertaining, and I'll find myself having intrusive thoughts and waving my Thor around pretending I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm not going to spend too much time on gaming performance because at this point, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip is very well known, having been in use by AYN for 2 years. If you want to know about emulation performance, I would direct you to reviews of the AYN Odin 2 line, so the Odin 2, Odin 2 Mini, and Odin 2 Portal, and all of the bigger channels have covered these devices and done in-depth performance testing, and not much has changed since then. Let's focus on Nintendo DS and 3DS, which are the systems I'm sure most of you are buying this device to play. There is a Melon DS fork that adds dual screen support, and I believe there are plans on integrating these changes back into the official repo, but for now I'll leave the fork linked in the description. In the video settings, there are these new dual screen presets, and depending on how your device is set up will determine on whether you want internal top or internal bottom. For the Thor, you want to choose internal top, external bottom. You can enable integer scaling if you want, but that will really cut down on the image size, especially on the bottom screen because of that weird aspect ratio and resolution. I'm upscaling to 4x, which is slightly below 1080p, and lightweight games like Advanced Wars Dual Strike will run at a smooth 60 FPS in standard performance mode. I did try to run Golden Sun Dark Dawn, which is a pretty demanding game, and I needed to bump up to the medium performance mode. Another game I tested was Metroid Prime Hunters, which basically requires the use of the stylus. You move with the left stick or D-pad and shoot with the left shoulder button, and everything else is controlled via the bottom screen. AYN does not include a stylus, which I kind of feel like for a device like this they should. I do have this pen with a rubber stylus tip, but it's not a great stylus. I did order this Switch stylus, but it didn't arrive in time for this review, so I just used my finger. It's a little awkward to play like this, and I don't think I would play longer than maybe 20 to 30 minutes at a time, but it's doable and there are no performance issues. Now I'm someone who is not generally super sensitive to input lag or delay, and I will subconsciously adjust how I play games to compensate for any lag, so it hasn't been an issue for me in the past. However, I did notice it on the Thor, and I think the easiest way to demonstrate this is with rhythm games. I've got Rhythm Heaven loaded up, which is a game I didn't know existed until very recently. It has a bunch of mini games, and the first one is called Built to Scale and has these square blocks with a hole in the middle that roll towards the center, and you're supposed to time it with the music to fling this peg to go through both squares once they reach the center. I'll show myself playing this game on a new 3DS I got in Japan to demonstrate that I can actually play through this minigame with decent accuracy. When I play rhythm games, I don't use visual cues to time the moves. Instead, my brain is focusing on the timing of the music and using the visuals to gauge when in the music that move is going to hit, if that makes sense. This minigame is easy to audibly predict because it's the same do, re, mi, fa, so, and you're flicking the peg on so I could play this with my eyes closed and just listen to the music. But if I tried to play this game on the Thor, I miss quite often because when I'm timing my flicks to the music, there's a split-second delay for when my input is recognized by the game and I'm missing a bunch. It's even more evident with Elite Beat Agents, which uses real songs. I was playing through the level with Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne, and if I want to play with any reasonable accuracy on the Thor, I have to rely on visual cues only and tap the targets a split second ahead of the music, which really throws me off. Android and emulation itself has some inherent input lag compared to original hardware, but it's especially bad for me on the Thor, and I couldn't reprogram my brain to compensate for this much input lag. Moving on to 3DS, Azahar officially has dual screen support, which you enable by going to Settings, Layout, and on Secondary Display Screen Layout, choose Bottom Screen for the Thor. Then we can launch our game and start playing, and it works pretty great. I'm not much of a 3DS player myself, but games seem to run well, and the dual screen support with Azahar is nice. You probably want to bump up to at least medium performance and possibly high performance to get some of these games running full speed at 5x upscale. Otherwise, I think you would only be limited in terms of what Azahar is currently compatible with. For Windows emulation, I use GameHub. Indies like Hollow Knight Silksong run at a smooth 60 FPS in standard performance, which is pretty impressive. Same with Celeste, another very lightweight indie favorite. Going heavier, Nier Automata ran anywhere from 30 to 40 FPS in high performance, low settings, but it was a little stuttery, so I locked it to 30 FPS and the gameplay was very smooth. Trails in the Sky First Chapter is a similar experience in high performance, low settings, around 30 to 40 FPS, so lock this one to 30 FPS as well. For game streaming, I'm using Artemis on the Thor and Apollo on my gaming PC. On a Wi-Fi 7 connection, I'm getting an average network latency of about 3 milliseconds and a decoding time of 2.5 to 3 milliseconds, which overall is really good. One thing I found weird was that Artemis didn't recognize when I pressed the back button, which normally brings up the menu so you can change settings or quit the stream. I tried tapping on the top screen to focus it or lock the controls to the top, but nothing worked, so I just enabled the floating icon in the Artemis settings. The Thor has a 6000 mAh battery, which seems a little small given how powerful this device is and how much it costs, but I think it works for this device because the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 doesn't seem to be as power hungry as the newer chips. Starting with regular emulation and working our way from lightweight to heavyweight, for Nintendo DS, Advance Wars Dual Strike in Standard will net a whopping 11 hours, which is just excellent. For Metroid Fusion on GBA as well as Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage on PlayStation 1, we're getting about 10 hours in standard performance, which is really good. Golden Sun Dark Dawn is a bit more demanding, so I needed to bump up to medium, but we're still getting a massive 9 hours of gameplay. Bravely Default on 3DS running in medium gets me about 6 hours and 40 minutes. Metroid Prime Remastered on Switch at medium performance, we're hitting about 6 hours and 15 minutes. God of War 2 for PS2 in Standard is more demanding, with about 4 hours and 21 minutes of battery life. For Game Hub, Celeste in Standard gets about 8 hours and 20 minutes, and Trails in the Sky First Chapter at high performance gets a little over 2.5 hours. Finally, I ran the Wildlife Extreme stress test from 100% until the battery completely died, which lasted about 2.5 hours. Let's start wrapping up with my likes and dislikes about the AYN Thor. Starting with my likes, I believe overall this is a pretty good device and there is a lot to like. You're getting good performance with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and because it's been used by AYN for the past 2 years, emulation compatibility is great with this chip. This isn't a power-hungry chip, and we can still hit 60 FPS without killing the battery, and you can expect anywhere from 4 to 10 hours of battery life for retro emulation and 2 to 8 hours for Game Hub. Without the grip, the Thor is pretty compact and relatively pocketable, but more of a jacket kind of pocketable. I wouldn't try and stuff this in your jeans. The dual OLED screens are nice, and the colors pop while any bezels will fade into the background, especially if you have the black color. I do appreciate that AYN came up with a hack to get the top screen using the full 120Hz without needing to turn the bottom screen off, even if it isn't really necessary for retro emulation, but it's nice to have for lightweight Game Hub and game streaming. And I cannot stress enough how thoroughly impressed that AYN did a complete 180 from the Odin 2 portal for these ABXY buttons. They are so quiet, which I really appreciate. Nothing turns me off from a device faster than loud and clacky buttons, and these buttons make me actually want to play games on this device. However, I do have some dislikes. The ergonomics are easily the worst part of this device and really hold it back from being what I would consider an endgame for people wanting a one-and-done dual-screen clamshell. The D10 angles just aren't right for holding this device comfortably. The screen is pitched too far forward and you have to bend your wrist to put the screen at the right angle so it's pointed at your eyes, which puts strain on your wrists. In terms of holding the device, there's just not enough surface area on the left and right to grip the device and comfortably access all the controls. I think if they had made it just a little bigger with some more padding on the left and right and pushed the D-pad and right stick inward more, this would have been much more comfortable. These controls look similar to the Odin 2's controls, and the D-pad positioning on that was not great to use either. I find myself doing some weird hand gymnastics to play twin-stick games, and D-pad-centric gaming isn't perfect either if you also need to use the left shoulder and trigger. Speaking of the shoulders, these shoulder buttons are terrible. They use the same dome switches as the D-pad, which feels great and the clicks are pretty muted, and I'm not sure how AYN pulled it off, but they managed to make these so very loud and clicky. They are the loudest controls on the device and are very annoying to use. The plastic on the device definitely doesn't feel cheap, but it also doesn't feel like a $300 device either. When I got the original Odin 2, I remember that device having some kind of powder coating applied, and it felt softer and very premium, and that was also a $300 device. The plastic on the Thor feels like a hard plastic with a very light texture from the mold, and it just doesn't feel premium. Even the new 3DS has that similar powder coat soft plastic feel to it, which feels great. AYN could have just applied the same coating from the Odin 2 and it would have elevated this device a little higher. The fan noise is also annoying, not because it's necessarily loud or whiny, because like I said earlier in the video, the fan is actually really quiet and just whooshes with no coil whine. It's that buzzing you hear when moving the device around that I call lightsaber mode. It's distracting, and this is the first device I've ever had this issue before. Overall, the AYN Thor is a device full of promise but also full of compromises. For everything I found good about this device, I found something that is not good. The screens are OLED, but the bottom screen isn't the right aspect ratio for anything. The speakers are front firing, but for emulation they're too quiet. The ABXY buttons are quiet, but the shoulders are obnoxiously loud. It plays pretty much everything, but the input lag is very bad, and so on. If you're willing to live with these compromises and are looking for a dual screen clamshell, I think this is a pretty decent device. Personally, I think dual screen devices are the next frontier for the retro emulation handheld market, in combination with the Snapdragon 8 Elite devices we're starting to see come out, like the AYN Odin 3 and Conquer Pocket Fit. The Thor is the third dual-screen device to come out this year, with the AYN Neo Flip 1 SDS, a Windows dual-screen handheld PC first, then the AYN Neo Pocket DS, and recently the Amberdic DS as well. This is very much a Generation 1 handheld, and if you're looking for something that is your endgame, I don't think this is it. I would wait and see what these companies come up with for their V2s in 2026. But let me know what you think about the Thor in the comments section below that like button. If you're new here and made it this far, I really appreciate you watching. Please leave a like if you liked the video, and consider subscribing if you want to see more videos from me. I do have the AYN Neo Pocket DS, which I've also been testing and working on that review, so once I have both reviews out, I'll do a comparison video where I put these two head to head, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching and have a great day.